Good evening. Hi. Welcome to the third and final Malkin lecture of the 2024 series. My name's Kirsten Rayoc. I'm the consulting curator here at the Armory for these talks that we do each year on the political, social, artistic, architectural, cultural history of the Gilded Age New York into the early 20th century. Tonight, we're delving into a topic that was crucial to New York City's development, its water supply. As the city grew rapidly in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, it faced a fundamental challenge: how to meet the ever-increasing demand for water. The solution was, as we know, that remarkable system of aqueducts and reservoirs built across upstate New York. But there's so much complexity and so much to know. And we're very fortunate this evening to have Lucy Sante, a Guggenheim Fellow recipient, who will guide us through the triumphs and tragedies associated with this ambitious project. In her talk, she'll explore how these decisions deeply divided New York's public, urban, rural, rich, poor, human, and animal. And in one way, it was actually connected here to this armory. And so that was one of the reasons that we reached out to Lucy for this talk. In 1900, the Croton Dam in Westchester County, at that dam, the workers were protesting the low wages and the long hours and went on strike. Governor Theodore Roosevelt called out the 7th Regiment of the New York National Guard from this armory, and yeah, exactly. Not the proudest moment, I think, of this. 1,500 guardsmen were deployed, and they stood guard, and it was really tense, and there was definitely some harsh interactions. But in the end, the workers prevailed, and the 8-hour workday was established out of that conflict. So we still love that today. And so, that is a great moment in New York labor history. Lucy's book, 19 Reservoirs, on their creation and the promise of water for New York City, was published in 2022, and we will have copies for sale afterwards in our library, and you can have yours signed. Intertwined in New York's cultural scene since the 1980s, Sante's writing and criticism has spanned art, music, history, and literature. Since the publication of her first book, Low Life, Lures and Snares of Old New York in 1991, her nonfiction has made her an indispensable chronicler of New York's untold stories. Her many accolades include the Whiting Writers Award, a Grammy for album notes, and the Cullman Fellowship. Please join me in welcoming Lucy Sante.
Thanks for that lovely introduction, and thank you all for coming. People often ask me, how did you come to write this book? It's so different from what else I've written, and there's a simple answer, which is that I live up there. I lived up near the Papacton Reservoir in the 90s, and since 2000 I've been living near the Ashokan Reservoir. And it was really the pandemic that brought this book into being, doing a lot of walking and imagining and figuring out what things must have been like. So, let's see, this is going to be a little tricky. It's going to be, okay, works. All right. By the dawn of the night, and by the way, the pictures will not always, it's a little wonky, but forgive me. By the dawn of the 19th century, New York City found itself in the position of the sailor in Samuel Taylor Coleridge's Rime of the Ancient Mariner, 1798, who was stuck on a becalmed ship for many long days. Water, water everywhere, nor any drop to drink. The city was surrounded by ocean and salt estuary, but had fouled or exhausted nearly all of its springs, wells, streams, and ponds, while the population galloped on relentlessly. From 1,000 or so Dutch nationals in 1650 14 years before the British invasion and 17 before the first wells were dug, the number had jumped to nearly 25,000 by the time of the Revolution. By 1800, it was 60,000. It was then that the city's political and financial powers recognized a crisis and understood that water would have to be brought in from outside the city. This it eventually did, in stages that covered the following century and a half. Between 1837 and 1842, city authorities built a 400-acre Croton Reservoir in Westchester County to the north, along with a 41-mile aqueduct and receiving and distributing reservoirs in Manhattan. As the urban population grew exponentially over the decades, its need for water strained these arrangements too, and after the Civil War, the city began adding smaller reservoirs, eventually a dozen or so, to the Croton system. Soon they too proved insufficient. At the beginning of the 20th century, the municipal government built a new aqueduct and vastly enlarged the original reservoir, although the system's long-term inadequacy was evident to engineers even before these enlargements were completed. A more radical solution was clearly and urgently needed. Once the idea of importing water had seated itself in the public mind, it was hard to dislodge, for without more reliable sources, the city could not survive. The moral justification for the seizure of water belonging to other regions, the landowners were always compensated, but under the terms of eminent domain, they were not permitted to refuse, was invariably that the needs of the many overrode the rights of the few. That was true as far as it went. More and better water would benefit immigrants, freed slaves, disabled veterans, the chronically ill, and the destitute, in addition to the middle and upper classes. But although such arguments were politically convenient, the architects of New York City's water importation schemes across the decades seem to have been rather more concerned with the needs of business. The requirements of the great mass of people reached their ears only on occasions when the city was in the grip of what was called a water famine, when pipes lacked sufficient pressure to serve the upper floors of buildings, making the whole metropolis a fire hazard. It follows that politicians and their commissioners tended to think of the extramural regions from which they proposed to pump as essentially uninhabited, since no industry was occurring there. Their attitude, in a word, was colonial. You could say that the very idea of diverting water from somewhere else to benefit the inhabitants of New York City represents a perversion of the trolley problem. In that ethical thought experiment, you were standing by the switch as a rail car comes barreling along, headed for 5 people tied up on the tracks. You can pull the lever and turn the car onto a branch line, but there you see 1 person tied up. Do you do nothing and permit 5 deaths? Or act and cause 1? You do nothing and impose a water famine on a teeming city? Or do you pull the lever and shift the onus onto much more sparsely populated rural areas? There is no satisfactory answer to this dilemma, and New York City had no real choice. The watershed of the Catskill Mountains was first proposed as a large and enduring source of drinking water by a chemical engineer writing in a supplement to Scientific American in 1886. He even specified the optimal location for a dam at Bishop Falls on Esopus Creek in Ulster County, a natural drainage point. When, in 1905, the Water Supply Board of New York City sent a team of engineers to survey the Catskill watershed, they also recommended Bishop Falls as the dam site for a reservoir that would eventually cover 8,300 acres. It would flood the Esopus Creek roughly midway in its course from the mountains to the Hudson River, in a section known as the Ashokan Valley. The city proceeded to seize the villages of West Hurley, Glenford, Ashton, Olive Branch, Shokan, West Shokan, Boyceville, Broadheads Bridge, Olive City, Olive Bridge, and Brown Station, as well as land owned by the Ulster and Delaware Railroad and some patches of forest preserve owned by the state. The $162 million earmarked for the Ashokan project included the cost of acquiring these properties, along with the construction of the dam, the dike, the waste and dividing weirs, the embankments and roadways, the temporary railroad that served construction, and of course the aqueduct, 92 miles of cut and cover, grade tunnel, pressure tunnel, and steel pipe siphon, traveling under the Hudson from near the mouth of the Wallkill River to connect with the Croton watershed at the Kensico Reservoir, back on the east side of the Hudson, outside what is now the New York City suburb of White Plains. The expropriated properties included some 500 private houses, along with schools, churches, stores, hotels, mills, quarries, farmland, and vacation homes. Under the terms of eminent domain, authors could not refuse, although they had to be compensated. The city's representatives, in the form of 3-member condemnation commissions, acquired territory just a step ahead of the demolition crews, giving residents 30 days to pack up and leave, as clearances moved in a clockwise direction through the valley. The commissions consistently lowballed estimates and generally paid around a third of the appraised value of properties, not even taking loss of business into consideration until forced to by a series of lawsuits. That only served to increase the long simmering tensions between upstate and downstate, country and city, even between the county seat and its rural dependencies. The farmers, as well as the millers, boarding house keepers, quarrymen, foresters, trappers, and others who depended on the land for their livelihoods, had always felt vulnerable to the machinations of lawyers, politicians, and contractors who represented the power of the city. The chain of events proved their deepest fears to be correct. They were entirely naked and powerless, without recourse when it came to negotiating with downstate powers. They were losing their homes without so much as proper compensation for the benefit of people 100 miles away, whom they already regarded with suspicion. The communities, some of them dating back to the mid-18th century, were valley villages of the sort that, had the reservoir never intervened, might have grown to support 2 gas stations and a regional high school, or they might have just blown away, their only remaining trace a historical marker on a roadside. At one commission hearing, a witness from New York City professed himself unable to construe what exactly was Brown Station. A citizen named Edwin Burhans volunteered to enlighten him. Brown Station includes everybody who receives mail from the Brown Station post office. There are 57 buildings. 12 of these are used for residential purposes only. There is a school maintained by the local authorities, a post office, and a railroad depot. A public telephone, telegraph office, and a store complete the places of prominence. He adds that from the post office, the village extends 1 mile west, more than a mile east, 1¼ miles north, and 1.75 miles south. The population consists of 57 families. There are 9 or 10 boarding houses, 2 sawmills, a pulp mill, and several quarries. There are 5 roads, one of which leads to the pulp mill and then goes on to Kingston. The others with more local issue. Pressed by a commissioner, Burhans admits that, yes, all 5 roads could really be considered one big road. The local jumble of small villages and small holdings were home to recurring types: small shopkeepers, boarding house keepers, millers and blacksmiths and quarrymen, ministers and school children. Their connection to the world beyond their own fence lines was, at best, a daily newspaper brought in by train. Few had telephones. The trip to Kingston, no more than 10 miles away, was undertaken by most maybe a couple of times a year. They spent very little money, consuming mostly things they cultivated themselves or bartered with a neighbor. But they weren't isolated. Dense family ties spread across the region, and neighbors had been the same for decades. They were bonded and pledged and sealed to the land. The Kingston Daily Freeman reported in May 1905 that experts appointed by the city to the condemnation commissions were instructed to accept only a third of the valuation placed on the land by its owners. A local expert denied that he'd been told to fix a value of $20 per acre across the board on all condemned lands. The total value for the valley's residential area, minus, that is, the land owned by the railroad, was $34 million. Shortly after this figure was made public, an item ran in the New York World. A silver ewer has been sold at auction at London for $21,000. In proportion to the amount of water it will hold, it was relatively as dear as the Catskill Reservoir. The actual process began in the spring of 1907, when the first of the 9 condemnation commissions got to work. These commissions were formed sequentially, although their actions overlapped. They seized land just before it was needed for the process of demolition and construction, so that, beginning at Bishop Falls on the southern tip, they moved first eastward and then clockwise through the valley in a process that would not end until 1911. The fees racked up by lawyers, appraisers, and expert witnesses were bounteous, so much so that the Freeman and other papers began referring to the proceedings as shaking the plum tree and the Ashokan region as plumland. Prices were negotiated per counts of individual trees and vines and orchards, but stalled on usage values for any kind of land, a matter that came down especially hard on owners of the many small bluestone quarries, as well as the proprietors of the boarding houses, who were compensated only for their building's value and not for lost business. In July 1907, Appraisal Commission Number 2 ruled that property owners could not recover damages to their land, a stratagem apparently meant to compensate for the commission's treating all parcels as equivalent, whether they held farmland, brush, a quarry, a dump, or a natural prospect, or for the loss of business conducted upon it, and the ruling was upheld by the special counsel. When Commission Number 5 attempted, all right, I'll get this straight one of these days. When Commission Number 5 attempted to counteract the ruling, accepting evidence of damage and lost business, the special counsel objected, declaring, according to the report, this is a quote, that for a man whose property was taken to get damages for his business was, quote, absolutely monstrous. By September 1908, a substantial camp was being constructed at Brown Station for a population of some 6,000 diggers, carters, foremen, and engineers, most of them unskilled, quote, including Negroes, Poles, Italians, and Slavs. The settlement was intended to last just 7 years and was accordingly never named, but streets were laid out with 125 four-room cottages, dormitories, a hospital, a bank, a company store, a sewage plant, and even its own reservoir. Still to come were churches and schools, the latter overseen by the combined forces of the Board of Water Supply and the Society for Italian Immigrants, and a police force intended to curb petty theft and quell disputes, especially between ethnic groups. This corps survives today as the Department of Environmental Protection Police Force, which has jurisdiction over the Ashokan Reservoir and surrounding property owned by New York City. In effect, the worker settlement became a city with all of a city's problems: assault, theft, and murder, not to mention drunkenness in significant quantities. There was no saloon on site and no liquor sold at the company store, but dives, often with a sideline in prostitution, sprang up all over. At one point, there were said to be 14 on the road to Marbletown alone. As for the police, the Freeman wrote, "The men composing the police force have been taken from various trades and businesses, and in some cases they and work have been strangers. They are not supposed to know criminal law, and they don't." And injuries, some fatal, were frequent on the work site. Falls, clothing caught in machinery, a pickaxe hitting a stick of dynamite. Still, somehow, the work got done on time, and the Ashokan Reservoir opened in 1915 and quickly became a tourist attraction. The city did very well. Its completion estimate had been $176,663. Its final total cost was $707,540. The difference accounted for by the need to expand the reservoir police and an expanded workforce owing to the demands of the recently won 8-hour day. Nevertheless, the city was known for not paying its bills. In 1910, the city began a campaign to make the reservoir tax exempt, which failed. Piqued, the city refused to pay its tax bill for years, until in 1930, the Ulster County Treasurer and the supervisors of the townships of Olive, Hurley, and Marbletown put the reservoir up for sale for back taxes. The city finally coughed up $576,023.40, with $54,000 in interest and fees in 1932. The Ashokan Reservoir, bigger than the whole Croton system, with an aqueduct more than twice as long as both Croton pipelines laid end to end, through which water flowed by gravity alone, had the potential to deliver 770 million gallons a day. The reservoir's surface was equal to that of Manhattan below 110th Street. Its contents could fill the Hudson River from the Battery at the southern tip of Manhattan to Hastings-on-Hudson in Westchester County. It took 3 days for a theoretical drop to travel from the Catskills to Staten Island, which received its first Ashokan water in January 1917. In October 1917, New York City held a 3-day celebration of its new water supply, during which 15,000 school children and 1,000 women from Hunter College participated in a pageant in Central Park called The Good Gift of Water. But the Board of Water Supply had already known for years that the Ashokan Reservoir alone would be insufficient in the long run. Engineers were surveying for proposed reservoir on Rondout Creek in Lackawanna as early as July 1907. Mention of a reservoir on the Neversink River first appeared in the papers in 1911. In 1912, there was talk of new dams on Schoharie Creek and the Delaware River. These projects would all come to fruition, but completion of the full scheme of linked reservoirs in upstate New York would take more than half a century longer. The first additional project to be undertaken was the dam on Schoharie Creek in Schoharie County, due north of the Ashokan Reservoir. This undertaking, approved by the city in July 1916, was smaller in scale than its predecessor, but represented a devilishly complex engineering challenge. The Schoharie flowed north from the foot of Indian Head Mountain at the southwest corner of Greene County, which lies between Schoharie and Ulster, into the Mohawk River. Its course had to be diverted south into a tunnel running from near Prattsville in Greene County down to Alaban on the Esopus northwest of the Ashokan Reservoir. 18 miles long, this would be the longest continuous tunnel in the world, its course blasted almost entirely through solid rock. The dynamiting and boring was to be accomplished via 7 shafts, ranging from 320 to 630 feet in depth. The tunnel's slope would average 4.4 feet per mile. The dam was to be constructed right atop the site of the village of Gilboa. founded in 1848 through the merger of the villages of Blenheim and Broome, both dating back to the mid-18th century. The village was home to about 350 people. With outlying residents, the total number for relocation came to roughly 500. Condemnation proceedings began in 1918, taking 204 properties, with the city operating in its accustomed way: three-man panels, relentless lowballing, dismissals of many claims for damages and loss of business. The residents, forewarned by the example of their Ulster County cousins, put up fierce if ineffectual resistance, relying on the fact that city employees could not legally enter their houses to turn them out. When people refused to move, however, workers tore off their roofs. Even then, some hung on, in empty houses, having prudently removed their furniture. Mary Brooks stood firm until she had to leave for a minute to confer with a neighbor, whereupon workers set her house on fire. A large fire in October 1925, which consumed 18 buildings, may also have been deliberately set. One man had a brainstorm early on. He built a new house in a critical location, thinking he could soak the assessors. When he was offered a niggling sum, he refused to leave. But he made the mistake of advertising rooms for rent, which gave workers legal right to enter. When the man stepped out on an errand, they padlocked the house. The New York Times noted in 1925 that of the residents of Gilboa in 1917, almost a third are dead, and suggested that broken hearts had hastened their end. The 1,330 bodies lying in 7 cemeteries also had to be moved. A witness recalled years later that when the graves were opened, the only thing that remained intact were men's silk ties. Okay. Although surveyed and mapped by 1910, the beginnings of another New York reservoir system, this time on the Delaware River, drawing on a massive watershed that sprawls across large portions of 3 states, were not undertaken until after the Depression, delayed by lack of funds and by political difficulties, as well as by the construction of City Tunnel Number 2, crossing the Bronx and the East River into Brooklyn, which usurped the title of world's longest continuous tunnel. City Tunnel Number 1 and City Tunnel Number 2 both carry water from the Hillview Reservoir on the from the Ashokan system. The Rondout Reservoir, the first in the Delaware watershed chain, began construction in 1937, but was interrupted twice, by World War II and the Korean War, and was not completed until 1954. Its neighbor, the Neversink Reservoir, 22 miles away, was begun in 1941, just in time for the war, and finished in 1953. Even while the Ashokan Reservoir was in the early stages of construction, planners of the boards of water supply had their eyes on a much greater prize, the Delaware River watershed. The Catskill Mountains, which cover portions of Ulster, Greene, Schoharie, Sullivan, and Delaware counties, are divided between 2 watersheds, tributaries of the Hudson River and those of the Delaware. The split runs northeast to southwest, roughly along the boundary between Ulster and Delaware counties. The Hudson watershed is very large, but the Delaware is larger. After the initial surveys and rumors around 1907, formal surveys for what would become the Pipacton Reservoir were carried out between 1918 and 1923. Exploratory boring was done at Shinhoppel in 1927, and the location for a dam at Downsville was decided on in 1933, reported in the Downsville News on April 6th of that year. The reservoir's location was chosen in 1938, reported in the Catskill Mountain News out of Margaretville on March 18th of that year. Thus it was that nearly a dozen years elapsed during which citizens of Papacton, Shavertown, Union Grove, and Arena were aware of the valley's imminent doom before condemnation proceedings actually began. The reservoir was to be 15 miles long by a seventh of a mile across at its widest point, and up to 160 feet deep, draining a watershed of 370 square miles. It remains the largest reservoir in the system, equal to the Ashokan and Schoharie combined, and 40% bigger than all 12 in the Croton system, holding 140.2 billion gallons at full capacity and supplying a quarter of the city's drinking water. At its eastern end, it sends its water through the Rondout Reservoir into the Delaware Aqueduct, which conveys it to the West Branch and Kensico reservoirs in Westchester County. From there, it flows to New York City, which, when City Council President Impellitteri threw the ceremonial switch, was consuming more than 1.2 billion gallons a day, and there was a drought on. One day in the summer of 1949, the total rose to 1.5 billion. The reservoir displaced 974 people, roughly 250 from Shavertown, 175 from Arena, 100 from Union Grove, 70 from Papacton, and the remainder from outlying farms. In addition, 2,588 bodies had to be moved from 13 cemeteries, many of them to the new Papacton Cemetery, created for that purpose. The villages were tiny and of an earlier age. Papacton, which had one general store and about 25 houses, had only been incorporated since 1902, although it had been a center of commercial shad fishing since 1785. Arena, known as Lumbertown until about 1890, began as a single store in 1795. Shavertown, the hub of the valley, was large enough to possess 3 general stores, 6 gas stations, 3 churches, and a barber shop. By 1950, the villages seemed to embody a bygone halcyon era, a vision of simpler times. The condemnation process had to play out, and having begun in 1947, it seemed to drip on endlessly. 5 years elapsed between the first buildings burned in Papacton and the last ones burned in Arena. Local newspapers marked one final curtain after another, seemingly every week. The auction at the Van Dusen farm near Shavertown, in the family since 1887. The last Christmas pageant at the Union Grove Methodist Church. The last trip on the Delaware and Northern, and the last mail at the Shavertown post office, which occurred on the same day. A month later, the last mail at the Union Grove post office, which had opened in 1857. The house-by-house sale of every building in Arena for relocation or scrap. The Catskill Mountain News published 12 verses by a resident of Shavertown. Nestled in a peaceful valley, with the mountains towering high, shaded round by shapely maples with the river flowing by. The iron bridge, the crossroads, leading from the mountains down. This, a meeting place of country folks, the place called Shavertown. Now the axe of condemnation has fallen on your head. Your people all have scattered. With a listless, weary tread, to find a place to live in, which never will be home, like travelers now in exile, cast on the world to roam. Trees uprooted, crushed and broken, pushed in piles mountains high, and the buildings cast reflections on the springtime evening sky. Oh, Shavertown still hanging by a single silver thread, which is just about to sever, and the world pronounce you dead. The East Branch is one of several tributaries, Delaware River proper. It rises near Grand Gorge in Delaware County, while the West Branch originates near Mount Jefferson in Schoharie County. They merge near the Delaware County town of Hancock. There is also the Little Delaware rising near Bovina and joining the West Branch at Delhi. By the mid-1940s, it was generally understood by the authorities concerned that there would need to be a third Delaware County reservoir. I guess that would be second Delaware County reservoir. A position on the West Branch near Cannonsville had been proposed in a 1925 treaty with Pennsylvania and New Jersey and was finally announced as a firm choice in 1950. Almost immediately, the Delaware County Board of Supervisors passed a resolution against the plan, which would inundate 100 dairy farms that produced more than 2 million gallons of milk per month and removed 800 people from their homes. When the reservoir's location was decided, the valley contained 74 farms, 2 creameries, 6 stores, 3 post offices, 5 churches, 4 schools, 2 hotels, 3 restaurants, and a community hall, distributed among the villages of Cannonsville, Granton, Rock Rift, and Rock Royal. There had been a time when the valley bustled, driven by the timber trade and its associated industry, such as factories that produced wood acid. In an 1896 Cannonsville directory lists more than 100 businesses. But all this was contingent on a steady supply of timber, and that gave out in the early 20th century. The last acid factory closed in 1924, and there remained only Cannonsville's 2 time-warp sawmills, descriptively named Slow and Easy and Speedwell. Soon the place was entirely dominated by dairy farming. The reservoir was to extend 16.5 miles from the dam site at Stilesville near Deposit to above Rock Rift, with a 5.5-mile finger from Cannonsville up Trout Creek to Rock Royal. The dam was to cut across the western end of a large flat island 2.25 miles above Stilesville and to stretch about half a mile wide. The village of Cannonsville was to lie under 75 feet of water. Route 10 from the dam to Rock Rift would be almost entirely flooded. The dirt road from the dam to Granton would be sunk. The blacktop from Cannonsville to Rock Royal would drown. This has been like half the lecture, right? On December 9, 1955, Mayor Robert Wagner broke ground with a clamshell loader at Shaft 2 of the new Delaware Tunnel near the hamlet of Harvard. The 3-man condemnation panels began their work in 1955 with the aim of claiming 19,910 acres, or 3.1 square miles. Condemnation posters started going up in the valley in the late fall of 1961. In 1962, 298 people moved out. In late January of that year, 11 Cannonsville residents filed an affidavit protesting the city's order to vacate immediately when it only acquired title on January 8th. And in addition, were asking the plaintiffs to move in the dead of winter. And Delaware County winters are no joke. Their lawyer, Herman Gottfried, called the action faster than Hitler's Blitz, and the court allowed a respite until May. The New York Times finally sent a reporter to take the local temperature in October 1963. In Cannonsville, he found the graveyard empty of bodies and the creamery with all its windows broken. Valley residents were, quote, vexed by the actions of the city. Even though the Board of Water Supply had made a point of buying provisions locally and hiring locals for construction and clerical work, they were still bitter. Quote, the farmers have regarded the destruction of these communities as wanton. They consider it symbolic of New York City egomania, an attitude that the outlying provinces exist solely as adjuncts to the city. A woman who moved their house 12 miles from Cannonsville to Stilesville told him, when they wipe out a whole community, your friends, neighbors, stores, merchants, There's no amount of money that can replace it. In December 1963, the Deposit Courier told the story of Missy, a German short-haired pointer who ran away from home and was eventually found by the foundation of her old house, which the family had vacated in July 1962. The Board of Water Supply had opened the Bureau of Claims in 1954 and had handled 200 properties, including more than 80 farms and 100 homes. The last 4 residents vacated in 1964. The dam was finished on February 16, 1965. The first water went over the spillway in May 1967. The last meeting of the Commission of Appraisal, which since 1935 had reviewed 6,700 claims for a total of $26,806,168, took place in October 1993. Its last major award in '92 was $20,598 to Margaretville Hospital for lost business, since 301 patients had moved out of its receiving area. Back in 1997, the Department of Environmental Protection had been reassuring, based on the results of metering, toilet replacement, public information, and other conservation programs achieved to date and expected in the future. It is projected that no additional water sources will be necessary for the next 50 years. On close inspection, this does not truly reassure. But it's been a while since the Northeast has faced a serious drought, and no incidents or complaints have recently made the news, so the health of the system has not been questioned of late, at least not in public. In the meantime, New York City continues to take its drinking water from those artificial lakes and mountain valleys, so inviting on a hot day in a region with no real lakes, albeit as taboo for swimming or boating as if they were meant for the gods alone. The ghosts of the drowned villages continue to haunt the popular imagination via roadside markers and twice-told tales, even as the tally of relocated citizens, never quite integrated into their new communities, in places where away might mean 5 miles and new might mean 50 years ago, continues to diminish. Farms continue to fail, and farmers continue to die, and land and houses continue to be bought by city people who wouldn't know their sheep dip from their cream separator. New York, like other cities, is filled with people who have no idea where the water comes from, and are only occasionally made aware that it is a precious and very finite resource that will become scarce again one day, perhaps quite soon. By then, there will be no untapped mountain valleys to draw from. Thank you.